But since these two men...
Yeah, it's a name for something.
Yes, that we don't know what.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting how fiercely people oppose the idea of the presence of intelligence when the design is overwhelming. Some people follow Kant.
Let me just a couple anecdotal things that underscore this, and also I think help explain the key argument of the book. But I'm standing on the soccer sidelines, watching my daughter play in a game a few years ago. She has a kind of gruff coach, shaved head, but he's a Microsoft programmer. And I had no idea he had any interest in the philosophy of science. Came up on the sideline when the game was in full flower, and he bumps kind of like this, and he says, "So what do these Darwinists think? The code just wrote itself?" And then he pauses and he says, "Not at Microsoft." And that was his take on the debate that I'm involved in. But it's actually a very compelling kind of observation. Bill Gates himself has said that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. And we know, and this gets to the central argument of the book, we know from experience, from uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, that programs always come from programmers. We know more generally that information in whatever form we find it, especially if it's in a digital or alphabetic form, always comes from an intelligent source, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription, a paragraph in a book, a headline in a newspaper, information embedded in a radio signal. Information always comes from an intelligent source, from a mind, not a material process. So the discovery of information embedded in digital form along the spine of the DNA molecule is a compelling indicator of prior intelligent activity. That's the central argument of the book, and it's something that I think is so almost commonsensical to people who have an intimate acquaintance with information technology, like Microsoft programmers, that the case for intelligent design, I think, is becoming very, very compelling, and we sense the debate is starting to shift in our favor because, in a sense, we own the metaphors. People understand information technology, they understand information processing systems. We are using those technologies all the time. We invent them, we create them, but we also know that information is the product of mind. It comes from no other source. There's only one known cause of a given effect. If you see the effect, you can reason back to the cause, and that's essentially what my book does.
Well, the most celebrated atheist of Great Britain in the 20th century, even apart from Bertrand Russell, was Anthony Flew, who developed the famous parable, Flew's parable,
right.
where he finds this, the explorer comes into this jungle and finds this perfectly manicured garden, and which screamed for the reality of a garden, and he was skeptical about all of that, and now he has come full circle to embrace theism. And the key thing that got to Flew was he came to the understanding that if there is not design that is intelligible, there's no possibility for science of any kind to operate. Right. Because it's all chaos, and science itself becomes an illusion. And so the fact that if the world is designed, if it's orderly, then it's intelligible. And you don't get unintelligible intelligibility. That's what finally convinced him. He should have seen it in his own parable 50 years ago.
No, he's a very interesting figure and a brilliant man.
Yes.
When the articles came out about his intellectual conversion in 2004, he was quoted as saying that his perspective on this bore some similarity to that of those American design theorists, as he put it. And he specifically cited the importance of the DNA argument and the fine-tuning arguments as having had a role in this change of mind. Your comment, though, about the importance of design to the whole scientific endeavor is a very important one. Oftentimes people will object to the work we're doing on intelligent design by saying it's a science stopper. But in fact, the idea of intelligent design was the science starter. There was a key word in the vocabulary of the scientists who started what we call the scientific revolution, that period in which modern science, as we know it, came to full flower between about 1300 and 1700. There was an assumption that they had, and that was that nature is intelligible. And they believed that it was intelligible because it was the product of a rational mind. And therefore, our minds, being made in the image of that rational mind, whom they took to be God, could understand the design, the order, the patterns that were in nature, and that made it worth the hard work of interrogating nature, of investigating nature, because we would eventually get to that deeper underlying order or pattern or design as a result of those investigations. So Kepler put it really poetically, saying that the natural philosopher, the person we call the scientist today, has the high calling of thinking God's thoughts after him.
Yes, exactly.
So when people say, design is a science starter or a stopper, I always say, well, it didn't seem to stop Sir Isaac Newton or Johannes Kepler.
Ultimate chaos is the science ender.
Yes, exactly.
And then you have to go down to the fact of whether this sense manifold that we have is the design that we find there's something that we impose upon chaos, or are we responding to something that's really there? That was the problem that Hume ended up with in his graveyard of empiricism, that Kant tried to save science from that kind of skepticism. Because if it's something that's pure subjectivity, there is no knowledge, which is what science is.
Right, and you can turn that as an argument against any particular argument for intelligent design based upon the empirical evidence of the natural world. You can say, well, it's just the human mind imposing that perception of design. It doesn't last very long, though, because we keep seeing it. And
not only that, but then you have to account for the human beings.
That's the key.
Imposition,
this is
intelligent imposition.
The work that Alvin Plantinga has done in making the case that the ultimate question in epistemology is, on what basis can we trust in the reliability of the human mind? The ultimate question in epistemology is, on what basis can we trust in the reliability of the human mind? And that's where I think intelligent design has something else really profound to contribute. Because if the mind is designed by a benevolent creator to know the world that creator has also designed, then there's a principle of correspondence between the way the mind works and the way the world has been designed, such that it can be known. And that's the ultimate guarantee. So I think in epistemology of our ability to know, and so there's a kind of theistic design argument that underwrites the epistemological enterprise of science itself, which in some ways is the most fundamental argument for design and the one that I think makes science possible, and was something that was presupposed by all those early founders of modern science. They were not afflicted by Humean skepticism because they believed that the world had been designed by the same person who had designed their minds to know the world. And so they didn't have the problem.
They were aware of the limitations of sense perception, of the empirical pursuit. And they realized that the formal knowledge had a higher degree of certainty than material investigation did. But they also realized the only way you can get out of the world and get outside of your own mind is through the senses.
It's through observation.
And so they were committed to the basic reliability, not the perfection, but the basic reliability of sense perception. And there's an interaction between that and the formal, like mathematics. Look how important mathematics has been to the advance of modern science. But it always drives me crazy when I hear all these debates, how little understanding of epistemology is there. How much that was assumed by earlier generations and explored deeply to say, how do we know anything?
Well, this is why
it's just jumped over.
One of the reasons I appreciate the work of David Hume so much, because he exposes the absolute dependence of the scientific endeavor on presuppositions that make no sense apart from a theistic commitment. My football player student was very impressed with this when he read Hume. Hume starts with questioning the uniformity of nature and causality in these things, and finds that he can't actually justify them on the basis of pure empiricism, that they are either something that you assume and then go forward and do science, or if you question them, then you end up in a position of skepticism. But those assumptions of the uniformity of nature, the assumption of causality, that all events have causes, are things that make sense in light of a theistic worldview. God is a God of order who makes the world in an orderly way. He makes our minds with the assumption that all events have causes and that nature is uniform, so that the assumptions that we have built into us, the Kantian synthetic a priori, are also things that are true about the world. So you get this principle of correspondence within a theistic worldview that gives us a reason to trust our minds and the things that we assume.
And makes causal thinking possible.
Exactly. It makes knowledge of the world possible.
Now, in this whole discussion of intelligent design, we know what's at stake. It is the ultimate question of theism. Because when we talk about intelligent design, we're not thinking of a UNIVAC computer that's controlled by the Wizard of Oz. But we're talking about some intelligence that is uncanny in its scope and its extent, corresponding very nicely to the biblical understanding of a God who not is only intelligent and knowledgeable, but he's omniscient. He has all knowledge. And when we see the scope of that in the investigations into the tiniest cell and so on, what does that do to your soul, Stephen?
Let me come back to the soul question in just a sec. I really do want to answer that. But let me unpack the relationship between the theory of intelligent design and these larger theological questions that arise from it. In formulating the theory of intelligent design, and I in particular, have relied on some standard methods of scientific reasoning, a principle that actually Darwin pioneered in investigating events in the remote past. He had a principle of reasoning, and that is that if you're trying to explain an event in the remote past, you should rely on our knowledge of the cause and effect structure of the world, and you should be looking for a cause which is known to have the power to produce the effect in question. Principle of sufficient or adequate reason. He got this from his mentor Charles Lyell, who put it this way. He said, in investigating the past, we should be looking for causes now in operation. When I came across that phrase in Lyell, for me, the nickel dropped, because I had gone off to Cambridge, having been exposed to some of these early pioneers in the ID movement, who thought there was an intuitive connection between information and intelligence. And I had a burning question, which was, could that intuitive connection be formulated as a rigorous scientific argument? So naturally, I began to study Darwin, and I came across this principle of reasoning that was key to his method of studying the events in the remote past. And when I got to the phrase in Lyell, when he said that we should be looking for causes now in operation, I asked myself a question. What is the cause now in operation for the production of digital information? And I realized there was only one. There's only one cause of which we know that's capable of producing information, and that's intelligence. And so I realized that by using Darwin's own principle of reasoning, I could formulate the case for design as a rigorous scientific, what's called an inference to the best explanation, where the best explanation is the one that relies on a cause that's known to produce the effect in question, and that cause is the only one that we know about.
Occam understood.
Yeah, okay. So that's a scientific case for intelligent design. What does it establish? It establishes an intelligence with the causal attributes that we know from experience, that is to say, a cause which is at least as intelligent as ours. Okay? That's what you can know, as it were, scientifically, using the same methods that Darwin, Lyell, and those other scientists used. Now, that then raises some second-order questions. Who is that intelligence most likely to be? And there we go beyond the method, the scientific method of reasoning that Darwin pioneered, and we get into a realm of philosophical investigation. And what the media wants to often do is they'll say, well, listen, if you, Steve Meyer or Bill Dembski, admit that you think that the intelligence responsible for the design in life is God, therefore you're doing religion and not science. But it's actually a little more subtle than that. What we're doing is we're basing our case for intelligent design on standard methods of scientific reasoning and on scientific evidence. But the case once made has implications that go beyond the merely scientific. And so the media likes to confuse the basis of the case for intelligent design with the implications of the theory in order to stigmatize it as being merely religion. Now, that's a long preamble to your question.
Right, yes.
But now we get to where it's really interesting, which is, okay, Meyer, Dembski, Behe, who do you guys think the designer really is? Well, among the scientists who accept intelligent design, opinions do vary, not between Meyer, Dembski, and Behe. We're all Orthodox Christians, but there are advocates of intelligent design who are not Christians who accept the evidence for intelligent design, and that makes sense because you don't have to be a Christian or a Jew or a theist to see the compelling nature of the evidence. But having come to the conclusion that there is evidence of design, it does raise that second-order question. Now, here's the way I look at that. There are two basic possibilities. The intelligence could either be immanent and within the cosmos, or the intelligence responsible for the design we see in life could be transcendent, beyond the cosmos. I favor the latter option for a number of reasons, but I have scientific reasons that support my judgment in this. One is that in addition to the design you see in life, you also see design in the very fabric of the universe, and what physicists call the fine-tuning of the laws of physics and chemistry. Now, that's clearly not design that could be the result of the actions of any creature within the universe. That's pointing to something beyond the universe as a whole. And so when you look at the evidence of design both in biology and physics, I find that the theistic design hypothesis explains the whole ensemble of evidence or evidences better than, say, the space alien idea, which has some other intrinsic liabilities, like if you invoke, as Richard Dawkins did at the end of the film Expelled, the idea that, well, there's a space alien, and then he says, but that may have been the source of the signature of intelligence we see in life, but that alien would have had to have evolved as well. Well, if you can't get the evolutionary process going in the first place on Earth because it can't solve the information problem, kicking it to outer space doesn't solve the problem either.
The same problem with transcendence and immanence we run into in theological philosophical arguments when we deal with the question of being, and we describe God as an eternal, self-existent being.
Right, exactly.
And then to explain the presence of any kind of creaturely being, and the immediate response of the skeptic is, well, why do we have to jump to a transcendent being to account for this? Why can't we posit a being within the universe who accounts for this, is what you're saying.
Right.
And I said, you have to understand, when we talk about transcendence, we're not talking about geography. We're not talking about where he lives, out there or in here. We're talking about an order of being. Mm-hmm. And if there's one piece of this universe that has the power of eternal self-existence, or the power of being within itself, it transcends everything else in the whole universe, and by its very being, its ontology, it's transcendent. And that's exactly what you're saying there.
It is, and this is where also conjoining the modern cosmological argument with the design argument I think provides a very powerful case for theism. I've been talking about the evidence for design in biology, the information in DNA and so forth, but also in the fine-tuning of the laws of physics and chemistry. When you conjoin that with the evidence from modern cosmology that suggests that there is a singularity at the beginning of the universe in which both time and space began, then I think you have a powerful case for a transcendent kind of cause. The Big Bang Theory and general relativity are bad news for materialism, because once the field equations of general relativity were solved by Stephen Hawking in 1968, it became clear that if general relativity is true, then there is a true singularity at the beginning of the universe. A singularity not just in time, but also in space. If you go back far enough, you get to an infinitely tight curvature in which there's no spatial volume. And I used to ask my students another question, which was, how much stuff can you put in zero spatial volume? The answer is nothing. What I think follows from that is that matter is a crummy candidate to be the thing from which everything else comes, exactly. that ultimate
I had some correspondence with Carl Sagan before he died over these questions, and he was willing to go back to that last nanosecond before the Big Bang, but he didn't want to even venture before that. He said, we don't need to go before that. I said, yes, you do. You absolutely can't stop there if you're really going to be involved in scientific pursuit of knowledge. You have to go there. And he didn't want to go there. And because he knew that even though he states at the beginning of his book and of his television show, we have cosmos, not chaos. He didn't want to go where that absolutely demanded him to go.
The one explanation for the origin of the universe that doesn't work anymore is the one that says that points to matter and energy.
Exactly.
Because when you get back to the singularity, the matter and energy are not something that you can refer to anymore. So.
Exactly. Well, I've really enjoyed this interaction with you, Steve.
Absolutely, R.C. It's nice to meet you in person.
Good to meet you, and I thank you so much for the book that you've written. I trust it'll help a lot of people besides that football player that came to see you.
No, thanks a lot.